It's been 2 years since the BC heat dome that left more than 600 people dead. Has the province done enough since then to adapt to the extreme weather? For that conversation, we've reached Andrienne Doyen. She is an assistant professor and director of the Resource and Environmental Planning program at Simon Fraser University. And we've reached her in Vancouver, where it is hot. So let me start with the first question to you, which is what everyone on the West Coast, I think, is asking right now. We're dealing with these temperatures. What are you doing to stay cool?
We are fortunate in that we have a portable air conditioning unit. So we've got that hooked up. We've got lots of fans. We've got lots of cold liquids and ice in the fridge. And we're not planning to turn on the oven anytime soon.
Andrienne, I think when we talk about temperatures like British Columbia is experiencing, certainly in parts right now, most of Canada probably thinks back to the 2021 heat dome, wondering whether or not what are seen by many as critical failures that led to so many deaths, whether or not those have been adequately addressed. What are your thoughts?
I think some of them or some of the failures have been addressed. One of the biggest critics of what happened before the heat dome in 2021 was the lack of communication. There wasn't a widespread communication around that a heat dome was coming and what that meant. So in the subsequent years, we've had heat waves the next 2 summers, and communication, I would say, both from the government as well as the media, has been much better at telling people sooner when heat events are going to occur and how they might prepare for that. So I would definitely say that communication has improved since the heat dome in 2021. I would also say what has improved is public health and emergency management type responses. So we're seeing a larger number of cooling centers being made available, as well as access to those cooling centers. So thinking about making sure that people are aware of those cooling centers, and even in some municipalities, shuttle services to get particularly vulnerable communities to those cooling centers. So those are 2 areas where I say we've definitely seen an improvement. So communication and then public health and emergency responses. Where we aren't, go ahead.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you next, is what needs to improve. I've certainly heard calls for greater access to not just cooling centers, but air conditioning in homes, particularly low-income homes. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think definitely one of the things that we need to see more of is not just air conditioning, although that's, I would say, sort of an immediate response and a Band-Aid that in certain locations and for certain vulnerable populations, we need those right away. And the government, both the provincial government and BC Hydro, are providing air conditioning units to vulnerable populations. So that's in process and that's happening. One of the challenges there is that not all buildings have the electrical capacity to handle that many air conditioning units added to their buildings. So we're seeing some troubles with the infrastructure itself. So we need to be thinking about how we might want to retrofit existing buildings so that they can handle air conditioning, but also that they can be more prepared in terms of passive measures. So not necessarily always relying on mechanical systems, but how can we improve our buildings and our landscapes so that they can help cool us down, again, without always having to rely on mechanical processes.
One thing I want to ask you about is the difference between a heat dome and a heat wave, because since the heat dome in British Columbia, as heat has spiked throughout the summer, it's a constant revisit to that conversation because of what was experienced because of that heat dome. But what BC is experiencing right now doesn't fit the definition of necessarily a heat dome, but that same heat could still be dangerous.
Of course, yeah. So one of the major differences is with a heat dome, we don't see a dip in temperatures. So we were seeing 30 plus degrees during the day and at night. So there was no reprieve. Sort of Darius was just saying earlier, he encourages everyone to stay inside, particularly if you have access to air conditioning. And even if you don't have access to air conditioning, you really want to make sure that your windows are closed, that your curtains are closed, and you're trying to prevent the sun from coming in. During a heat wave, normally what happens is it cools down at night. So that's when you want to open up your house. You want to open up the windows and doors and let that cool air in and cool down your unit or your house, and then go back to closing it up. During the heat dome, we couldn't do that because it didn't get cooler at all. So again, no reprieve, which meant our bodies and our houses couldn't cool down. And that was which made it much more sort of extreme in terms of impacting vulnerable populations and the high number of deaths that we saw.
Given your role, just finally, given your role in environmental planning, the fact that we do have these conversations now, serious conversations about what to do during extreme heat events, maybe they weren't had quite as often prior to the heat dome. That has to be, is that a positive at least to take away from all of this?
Definitely. I think when I was being asked in 2021, what do I hope comes out of this? And I was saying, I really do hope that we talk about this more. We need to be planning for extreme heat. And so I am glad that it has remained part of the conversation. We are having more people at the provincial and municipal level engaging in discussions around what does it mean to plan for extreme heat and really beginning to think about that. I still think a lot of the thinking is more short term. So again, public health and emergency management. And I would really like to see more discussion and more energy and action to longer term thinking. So we're going to keep getting heat waves here in BC. And so how do we respond to that so that in 5 years, 10 years, 30 years time, our communities are better off and more prepared for the heat? So that's where I'd like to see more attention. But we are definitely talking about heat more than we used to.